This is Tao Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.
Welcome to yet another episode of Tao Unbound. I'm Aharoni, your host from Tel Aviv. It is my great honor and privilege to host the esteemed and distinguished Professor Orit Rozin. Welcome to our studio.
Hello.
It's such a pleasure. To those of you who don't know, Professor Rozin is a member of the Faculty of the Humanities at the Department of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University. She's also the academic director of the Koret Center for Jewish Civilization. Those of you who know the name Koret is from the San Francisco Bay Area, a very well-known Jewish philanthropic entity that supports many things in Israel, including helping small businesses and so on. And I'm glad to see that they're involved with Tel Aviv U on the issue of Jewish civilization. And we will ask Professor Rozin all about the work of the Koret Center. But before that, let me just tell you a little bit about her education. She got her BA from Tel Aviv University, from the Department of Jewish History. Then her master's also from Tel Aviv University, also in Jewish history. And then her PhD also at Tel Aviv U, and it was in Jewish studies. And the dissertation was a subject that is of great interest to me, From We to I, Individualism in Israel Society in the early 1950s. Supervisors were Yosef Gorny and Avraham Shapira. I remember as a young student, I studied Yosef Gorny here at Tel Aviv U. And so I have some of his books until this very day on my bookshelf. It's such a pleasure. What an incredible biography you have, and you are the ultimate product of Tel Aviv U.
Yeah,
right.
I am.
You did it all here, right?
Yeah,
in-house.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, welcome to our podcast, and as we always do, we'd like to start with your own personal story of how you became a historian and why this particular field, and when did you realize that this was the thing, your career?
Oh, it's rather, I let serendipity guide me in my life. So nothing was intentional. I just, and I enrolled and I started studying literature, and I found out doesn't interest me. And then I moved to history and interdisciplinary studies at the Faculty of Humanities, and I loved it. I loved the interdisciplinarity, and I loved history. And one of the first courses I took was with Professor Gorny, and it was a huge hall with lots of students, and I loved it. It was just, he was talking about us. It was our identity. And I think that Israeli collective identity is really what attracted me. And basically this is what I do in various ways until this very day.
And I think that you use the term interdisciplinary, and it's true, because when you study about the history of Zionism and you talk about collectivism versus individualism, that's a sociological, anthropological issue, and it's also a political science issue. It's also, there's so many aspects, there's so many disciplines, dealing with the same issue. And so you've been studying and teaching at Tel Aviv U since the completion of your PhD, and you published several books. And what I would like to do, with your permission, is to first of all mention them, and obviously I'm sure that our audience can find them. But so the first, I'm assuming that your dissertation that was published in 2002 became a book, and that's the title of that book, From First Person Plural to First Person Singular, Processes of Individualization at the Beginning of the First Decade of the State. Now, just these days, we're hearing about the fact that there's a net zero migration, net negative migration from Israel. And I read somewhere that 2024 was a record year. 83,000 Israelis left the country. But from what I know from my parents, the years after 48 were actually, in terms of the number of Israelis that left the country, were more devastating, because many, many young people left the country when the country was very, very small, with 550,000, 600,000. This is before the massive migrations. So the big question is, what was really that change from the collective to the individual? When did it occur? And because we were brought up on the narrative that it was all about the collective.
Well, so first of all, let me just put the record straight that in 1948, 49, 50 and 51, there was a huge influx of immigrants into Israel. And the year 1953, we had more Israelis leaving the country than entering it. But this was an exception.
What happened in 1953? The recession?
Yeah, there was a terrible recession, and there were no jobs, and the conditions on the ground were very difficult. So I think this was the
Those were the years of Dov Yosef, right?
Yes, but Dov Yosef was the minister of austerity, basically, but by then he was not. He wasn't doing this role anymore. But it doesn't matter. In 1952, there was a new economic policy, and this policy meant that prices of food went up significantly. And in 1953, there was a terrible unemployment problem. So you combine...
And they had the tlushim, the food stamps.
Yes, they still had them in 1953. The thing is that the height of the austerity was in 1949 till 51. By 51, prices started going... By the end of 51, prices started going up. So the whole idea about the austerity was that you get the stamps and you're able to feed your family, and everybody gets an equal ration, an equal basic ration, so nobody starves. At the end of 51, family doctors already complain that people who without means, like a vast group of people with no means, most of them are freshly arrived immigrants, are unable to sustain their families. So in 1953, they announced this change, and from then on, you see that once the prices go up, the whole idea of austerity is eroded, because the whole idea was to keep the prices low so everybody will have access to food. And the stamps were not, you were not getting a ration with the stamp, but the stamp was like something you had to present in order to purchase the food. So if the price is too high, and there are not enough jobs, that people just felt they cannot.
So let me ask you the $1 million question about collectivism in the early days, even pre-statehood. Mm-hmm. Was it really about ideology, or was it a byproduct of necessity? Because I tell you from my own family history, my father, who came from a very Orthodox family in Jerusalem, was in an orphanage in Jerusalem, and he became a runaway kid, and he ended up in a kibbutz. And he was raised in a kibbutz. So this Orthodox kid is being raised in a kibbutz, and through him, we were introduced to kibbutz life. And I found very little ideology. And I met his peers. All of them came from broken families. The kibbutz saved their lives. And there was very little ideology. And basically the story that I heard is that collectivism was in the first place a byproduct of existential necessity. They needed to survive. It was easier to survive as a group rather than as individual.
Well, I can say it's always both. It's an ideology, and I think the basic component of collectivism is nationalism. So when you are a startup nation in the real sense of you're building a nation, that you need to build the us.
Right. The ethos.
The ethos, but also who are we? Your identity, not as a person, but as a group. And you somehow want to build similarities between people. So we have the same kind of, let's say, after the state was established, you want to have like a kind of a Seder for Independence Day. So you want to produce a kind of cultural heritage, like an invented past, so we can all share it together. So the whole idea of building a nation since the early, I would say, 20th century, but basically the 20s and onwards, is to build a kind of nation. And the nation building itself is collectivist.
And I think that what they did with the Jewish holidays is a perfect example of creating a new narrative to serve the goals of the national movement, like Hanukkah, for example, celebration, or even Passover. Yeah. By the way, Shavuot, when I lived in America, I realized that Shavuot is Chag Matan Torah overseas. Here, it was Chag HaBikurim. It was all about agriculture. Over there, it was all about... So it was a different content to the same holiday.
Yeah, and also Tu B'Shvat. My colleague Chizki Shoab wrote a wonderful paper about how Tu B'Shvat was created as a local holiday rather than something that was entirely different in the diaspora.
Right.
So holidays are a good example, but it's in everyday, in folk dancing, in hiking, in climbing the Masada, in youth movements. It's everywhere.
And obviously the centrality of the army in what comprises national identity. And it's interesting that Ben-Gurion, who was perhaps the mastermind of turning the army into the pillar of Israeli collectivism, is also the one who warned us of the dominance of Israeli militarism.
It's complicated because in 1951, Ben-Gurion told Israelis, you're not vigilant enough. You're too complacent. You need to wake up. Things are really, dramatic. You need to be prepared. You need to be aware. Because, you have heightened times when people are really anxious about security, and there are other times you're more relaxed. And he was worried about this, we're being too relaxed. And in the 60s, something else happened, because then, but after the Sinai campaign of 56, Israelis were really feeling, we have the good times. There, what's happening around the borders is, it's less, we have less friction. The army was more organized, because what happens in the 50s, it's not the army of 48, because a lot of people left. And what you have in the army in the early 50s is mostly immigrants who don't even share a language, let alone ethos, collective identity, or anything. So it was a kind of a miserable military. In the 60s, something else happened, because the whole security situation changed, and there was a kind of feeling of prosperity, and, this is where the espresso generation was born. And
it was a strong European orientation, and the military aid came mostly from France.
Yes, and at that time, there was this government committee that was formed with all, everyone who counts, including the chief of staff and everyone. And they wanted to make the military intentionally a focal point of society, but not because they wanted to have everyone on alert and everyone vigilant, but because they wanted to serve the security apparatus. So it's the same kind of rhetoric, but a completely different agenda. Or because in the 50s, the army was not doing great. So we needed the civilians to fend for themselves, to be prepared to do stuff, to volunteer, to carry arms and all that. In the 60s, we want to build the prestige of the military. Not the same idea. And we want to allocate a lot of funds into the military where people say, well, we have other needs as well. So it's also a budget thing. So we have different agendas at different times, although they seem the same, but they're not.
And the population is growing massively during that decade, 1950s.
Yeah, you have
especially until 58, right?
Yeah, we have the masses come between 48 and 51. Then you have another two smaller waves in the mid 50s from Morocco, from North Africa, and from Eastern Europe mainly.
And then, of course, there's the function of technology, military technology that was not available in the 1950s is all of a sudden available in the 1960s.
Yes, and this is a major shift because in the 50s, you need a man or a woman with a rifle. In the 60s, it's a professional army. You have the Air Force, and you have other, professional units. And so it's a different, a rifle would not change things on the ground.
So would you say that that's when you mentioned the espresso generation, that's when individualism is being introduced, or how do you see that process happening?
I think it's happening in many different fronts. So you can look at what happens in legal terms. One of the agents of individual rights is the Supreme Court. So I have a chapter on the Supreme Court ruling on Kol Ha'am in my dissertation. That guaranteed freedom of speech and protected the press, the freedom of the press.
Which is a landmark case in the history of Israeli media. Kol Ha'am was a publication, and if you want, you can elaborate.
Yeah, Kol Ha'am was a publication of the Communist Party, and I will not go into the details, but the thing is that the Supreme Court protected this media outlet against a decree by the Ministry of the Interior that wanted to punish this outlet in 1953, and this precedent really changed or paved the way to protect freedom of press later on. So you see that the Supreme Court is one agent. You have liberal parties like the Progressive Party, and it was a very small party in 49 and so on, but it was like 4 or 5 members of Knesset, but they had Orit Rozin as the Minister of Justice, who had had more influence than his share in politics. So this is like the legal professionals bring liberal values from Europe, from mainly from the Weimar Republic, but also from the U.S. as like Agranat, for instance, Justice Agranat, Chief Justice Agranat, and they build this individualism in their own way, like something that we know today to be liberal rights.
By the way, would you say that Golda's foreign policy and the introduction of the aid program to Africa was part of her American upbringing?
Possibly. It was a kind of practicing soft power, I would say, but it is part of the upbringing in the U.S. It's part of if you see what the U.S. does in the 50s, it, supplies food to different places, including Israel, by the way, as a way to... There's
a chapter, I'm a big basketball fan, and a lot of people don't know that the U.S. troops traveled in World War II, especially in North Africa, with 1,500 basketball coaches that went to the local high schools to teach the kids how to play basketball in Egypt, in Algeria, in Tunisia, and all those places.
I didn't know that.
It was part of American soft power.
Yeah. So you see the same thing that Israel's trying to do in Africa, basically. And then you have other agents. Some of them are just coincidence in the sense that when you see the Mizrahi immigration in the early days of the state, from Iraq mainly, but also a small group from Morocco and other Middle Eastern, MENA countries or Middle Eastern countries. And the reaction of the veteran population, which is mostly Ashkenazi, is not pleasant, because what happens is that many of the new immigrants are housed in temporary camps, or we call them in Hebrew ma'abarot. And the conditions on the ground are horrible. And the people who are meant to go and help them, survive the winter or survive, this very harsh reality, which basically is like a DP camp. They look at the immigrants and they see the conditions, they see the filth, they see the inability to keep themselves clean. There are not enough toilets, for instance. So the whole condition, and people get sick, and they don't have enough access to water. The water is far away, and they blame they see the immigrants, especially the Mizrahi immigrants, as people who are not unable to, keep clean. And this, I think this is the essence of it. And they feel, how come they are we? I mean, part of us. This is like so they, in a way, move away from them. They're not seeing them as equals. So it's not just economic conditions, it's not just housing, it's not, the immigrants being able to, get proper jobs. It's also the aversion of the established or the veteran Ashkenazi population that really changes their view of themselves. They feel inferior. And this is...
They feel different.
Different, and also, I think it's Axel Honneth talks about it when he says contempt is not left outside of your body and your feelings. You feel the contempt, and it does something to you. And if you feel you get, you feel that you're, people make you feel that you're worth, you're recognized. We recognize you. We respect you. You have another. You build a different personality inside you. So this is another way of constructing. You want to separate yourselves from, the hoi polloi, and so you're not. This is also moving away from collectivism in a sense.
Right. It's interesting. Because this attitude towards the other is typical of every immigrant society.
Yes.
But here there was a specific mixture, I think, because of the dominance of collectivism. I think because it existed pre-statehood with the Jews of Yemen, that the veteran, my mother's side of the family is from Yemen. They came early 20th century. Mm-hmm. The people in the Moshavot, in the Jewish settlements, did not know. They had no idea what to do with the Jews of Yemen. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, they were told that they were Jews. On the other hand, they looked like Arabs. So they put them in compounds outside of their Moshavot, like a little ghetto. Mm-hmm. And that's what they did with the Yemenite Jews back in the day. Same thing. It's the otherness that scares people.
Yeah, but the thing is, when you try to build a collective society in the sense of a nation, this person who's very different from you is also part of your nation. So what does it do?
Right.
It's more complex in this sense. And also the immigrants themselves, and had expectations. They expected the veterans to like them, to see them as part of the greater...
Part of the team.
Part of the team, part of the nation, part of who we are.
And then the army and the police, law enforcement and police become the outlet, and the arts also. Just like any other immigrant group in other immigrant societies, right? They find a way to integrate through the arts, singing, dancing, or army or law enforcement.
But also self-employment.
And self-employment.
Business.
Right.
Business.
Yeah, and many of them did extremely well, especially the Jews from Iraq.
Yeah.
Very extremely well in business until this very day.
Yeah.
They run banks and big companies and so on.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So this is another angle.
And this is also the root, would you say, to today's politics of grievance that you see all over the Western world?
I don't want to talk about the rest of the Western world because I think in every society it's a little bit different. There are same problems, but they're not exactly the same circumstances. And because Israel was not just a normal or regular country where people immigrated to. You had expectations, and I think the expectations changed everything. Because they change who you are and where you want to go and how do you want to feel. And currently one of my students, he's writing a dissertation about the Jews of Morocco and their own struggle and agency and in trying to integrate into the Israeli society. Not just, so most studies look at what, Ashkenazim did to the Moroccans, but he looks the other way around, what Moroccans did for themselves, how they pushed to integrate, which I think is very... so this is not just a politics of grievance, it's also politics of agency. And it's very timely, I think, that we should look at it this way too.
Right, interesting. And how do you explain the differences between the various groups? Talking about Jews from Arab countries. They were very different.
Exactly.
The Jews of Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Muslim countries like Iran and then the Jews of North Africa. Even within North Africa, there's huge differences between Jews of Algiers and the Jews of Morocco.
So they were not seen as one group initially. And they were not. And they didn't see themselves as one group initially. But gradually, they became Mizrahim or Adot HaMizrach. But they were not... The Jews of Basra and the Jews of Baghdad didn't get along, let alone.
Right.
They didn't eat the same food. They didn't share the same habits.
So your historical research discovers that the labeling of all of them under Oriental label was by those who received them, right? That's what you're saying?
Yes and no. They were labeled, but they also created their own Mizrahi identity. I think it worked both ways. It's not just labeling. It's also seeing the sameness because of they had shared problems in the sense. But there are groups, I don't think that can be seen as the same. Iraqis felt different, and they felt different from the Kurds, who also came from Iraq. So,
by the way, I have to tell you a story that maybe you can put it in the historical context. So when I grew up in Holon, and in the 1970s, there was a big wedding hall in the heart of Holon called Ulamei Argaman. And there were weddings there. Like we would go and take a look at the wedding as kids. And one day, it was like a wedding, but it was not a wedding. It was a celebration of King of Morocco's birthday, which I was stunned. It was in the early 1970s or mid 1970s, maybe 74, maybe 75. And in my mind as a young kid, I'm 13, 14 years old, Morocco is an enemy country, right? It's not a friend of Israel. Why are we celebrating the birthday of the king? And is that part of this individual, the craving or the yearning to have some individual expression in such a collective society?
I think this is what my student Jonathan Ben Shushan is writing about, so I have to give credit to him. What he's showing is that while some immigrants tried to shed their Mizrachiness, others adopted their collective roots and tried to integrate through that, to bring it into the Israeli culture, their Moroccanness, I would say.
Yeah, and to be proud of their heritage,
Yes.
of course, which they
Yes.
are. They're great,
Yes.
great cultural
Exactly.
assets. We can talk about your first book for hours, but you then also published another book called A Home for All Jews, Citizenship and National Identity in the New Israeli State. And here I would like to ask you a question which is very important for our listeners and viewers, about the citizenship as opposed to, or the citizenship law and how it came about, the law of return, as opposed to the cultural definition or the religious definition of what makes you a member of the collective. These are two different things. And so how did that come about from an historical point of view? How the state became more progressive, if you may, than the religious law?
The state did not become. The state was, in this sense, was quite liberal because they didn't want to get into it. And until 1950, and in fact 58, the whole who is a Jew question is raised because the minister of the Interior doesn't want to ask people if their mother is Jewish or what. He says, if you feel like a Jew, I'm not going to ask you. And the religious parties are against it. So this is why the religious parties changed this liberal inclination later on.
Where was Ben-Gurion in all this issue? Because today, obviously, even people that care about the future of religious practice in Israel, people that are observant Jews, are worried about the fact that the religious parties have so much political clout that it gives them they're in a position to completely distort the balance.
Okay, so this is another question, but I want to go, if you allow me, I want to go to the book. Please. Because I didn't write about the citizenship law. There are other people who wrote about it, and I wrote about the way citizenship or rights were formed in the new state. In the first chapter, I write about right to childhood. So it's not what you think. When you think about rights, you don't always think about the rights that I talk about. And the right to childhood is, and I think about it, or I write about it through the law that criminalizes child marriage. Because the whole struggle against child marriage is conducted both during the Mandate era and between, and until it took 16 years for the Brits to legislate to put some kind of, to outlaw or to criminalize child marriage, but it was very lenient in 1936. And when the Yemenite Jews arrive after 48, first of all, they want to try and regulate and take care that children or young girls are not married off by their parents, according to the mandatory law. And then one Knesset member has the initiative, and she wants to change the law and to outlaw child marriage from the age of 18. So people cannot, girls cannot marry before 18. And there's a huge debate with, of course, with religious parties. And Yemenites are actually not really part of this ongoing debate because it's mostly the chief rabbinate who decide that the proper age should be 16 and not 18. And Adam Maimon who wants 18. So they settle on 17, but the numbers are not the issue. The issue is the whole cultural identity behind them. Who decides on marriage? Is it the woman or her parents or guardians? Who has, and what do the feminists of that time want? They want the girl to have a proper childhood so she can have an opinion of her own when she's...
And this is influenced by ideas coming from Europe?
Yes, it is. The struggle in Europe begins in the early 20th century, and international women's organizations throughout this region, including Iran and Transjordan and Syria and Lebanon and Egypt. So this is not a new issue. It's about women's rights. And they want to protect the childhood of girls so they become adults who are responsible and are individual and can make their own decisions. Because if you're married off at 10 years old, and some girls were married at 10 and even 8 and 11 and so on, you have unable to develop. So it's about citizenship in the sense of being an adult.
So your book, in your book, you basically discover, or you make the case that in Israel it was already back then a struggle between the religious establishment and those who wanted to protect the rights of children. It's very, very interesting because when you look at what's happening today, again, when it comes to education, for example, those who want ultra-Orthodox kids to study English and math, and those who want to deprive them of that. It's very similar because in the 21st century, if you don't know English, if you don't do math, your chances of succeeding in life are very, very small. Exactly. Or at least it diminishes your chances very, very significantly.
Yeah, so it's about different rights, and it's also about the right to be heard. It's not just freedom of speech, but the immigrants, and I go back to the immigrants, want to be heeded. They don't just want, because they can speak, and they protest with their feet, and they do all kinds of things. But they want to know that somebody heard them. So this is sort of an ideal type of right.
Now, I can spend hours with you talking about this, but our time is running out. And I just wanted to ask you one question. And by the way, and I want to mention the fact that there's also a third book, which we don't have time to cover, titled Emotions of Conflict, Israel, 1949 to 1967. And I'm sure that this book also covers exactly the years of the pre-60s, the 6-Day War, and after that war, everything changed, right?
Exactly.
So
everything changed, including our emotional culture. Because today, revenge is a legitimate emotion, and it wasn't a legitimate emotion before.
I mean, I would say that after 67, we became a little bit of original Goliath. If before that we were clearly the David, we became that regional military superpower. But the question I wanted to ask you, which we will wrap this interview with that question, is what are you working on now?
Okay, so I'm working now on the experience, the way Israelis experience Palestinian terror attacks in the 1970s, how they feel them, sense them in their bodies, how do they perceive reality? What does it mean when you say terrorist or you say terror, what does it mean?
As a historian, what are your sources? How do you find information about that?
Everything. I use everything, from photojournalism to newsreels to newspapers to... It's when you know what you're looking for, it's everywhere. In government minutes, in reports by the military.
By the way, one of the most effective books I've ever read about the conflict was by Tom Segev, which was based on letters that British soldiers wrote home. I think it's a wonderful way, because back in the 70s, people were still writing letters.
Yes. So it's basically whatever I can put my hands on.
Wow,
everything.
fascinating.
Letters,
Fascinating.
newsletters, everything.
Amazing. I can't wait to read that study. Professor Orit Rozin, such a pleasure to host you in our humble studio. And good luck in your next chapter.
Thank you.
Thank you for educating us about this incredibly important issue. And to our viewers and listeners at home, goodbye from Tel Aviv until our next episode.